What's up, friends? Dan Vega here, back with another tutorial, and today we're talking about pagination in Spring Data JPA. Before we get started though, in case this is the first time you're coming across one of my videos, my name is Dan Vega. I'm a Spring developer advocate for VMware Tanzu. I also run the website danvega.dev. If you want to head over there, you're going to get a whole bunch of free stuff. I have a blog, I have a newsletter. I love to write. What we're going to go off of today is actually a blog post I just published, and this is an entire blog post dedicated to what we're going to cover in today's tutorial. So if you're more of a let me just read through a blog post first, then watch the video type of person, this is great for you. Again, head over to my website, learn a bunch about me, get a whole bunch of free content. With that, let's get started with today's tutorial. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit of the blog post and then we'll push it aside. Again, you could read this on your own pace and I'll go through basically these steps in a video form. But what we're talking about is pagination with Spring Data JPA. If you have just a few records, you could create an endpoint in a REST API or Graphql, whatever, and you can just return all of the records. In the real world, though, you'll probably have more than a few records. Thousands, hundreds of thousands. In this case, you wouldn't want to return all of those records at once. That would be a huge performance hit, and you wouldn't want to do that no matter what device you're on. So on the client, you just want to display a small number of records that allows the user to kind of say next, next, previous, or click on a particular page number. So that's what we're going to build today, and we're going to walk through each of the steps to go ahead and do so. This is in part one of a larger tutorial that I worked on this week for both Spring Data REST or Spring Data JPA Pagination and then the GraphQL side of things. So stay tuned if you're interested in some GraphQL content. That is coming up real quickly. So with that, what you're going to do is follow the guide here. And the first thing that I'm going to do is head over to start.spring.io. Real quickly, in that blog post, there's a link to the GitHub repository. Again, it says Spring for GraphQL paging. Don't worry, the GraphQL stuff is kind of in the background. The Spring Data JPA paging is front and center, and that's really what we're going to cover today. All right, so I'm going to close that. I'm going to get rid of my face here, and let's go through this tutorial together. All right, so we're going to start here over at start.spring.io, and we're going to create a new project. This is the Spring Initializer that allows us to kind of bootstrap a Spring Boot project. So we got to make some decisions here. The first is Maven or Gradle. Really just use whatever you're comfortable with. I've been using Maven forever, so I'm going to use Maven. Again, same thing with the language. Choose whatever language you're comfortable with. I'm going to use Java here. The version is really up to you. I'm going to use the latest stable 2.6.7. In the screenshot in the blog post, I'm actually using 2.7 RC1 because, again, this was a two-parter as a bigger part of a Spring for GraphQL tutorial that I was working on. So that's why I had selected that. But we're just going to call this, we're going to go with the group of dev.danvega. We're going to give it a name. Again, let's just go with JPA Paging demo project for Spring Boot. The package name, you actually have to go ahead and get rid of that, which is fine. Let's just call it that. We're going to use packaging of jar, and we're going to use Java 17. So now we need to decide what dependencies we're going to use. We're actually going to build a web layer of this so that you can see it from a REST API standpoint. We'll build a control out so you can see how we can get all of the records and then how we can work with paging. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Spring Web. I'm also going to need Spring Data JPA, so we'll go ahead and select that. And then we'll need a database. I like using H2 for just these demos. Again, you can see that it's a fast in-memory database that supports JDBC API as well as R2DBC. So if you're using a reactive, that will work. But here's the important part. It's a small footprint. And all you got to do is add this dependency and you get a database. And you don't have to set up and configure anything. So this is great. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and generate this project and open it up in whatever text editor or IDE you like. I'm going to open it up in IntelliJ and we'll get started. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just open up this pom.xml. You can see that we are using Java 17. Here's that group ID and that artifact ID that we put in. We have included Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. So this gives us a whole bunch of Spring Data info, or Spring Data dependencies. We've included Spring Boot Starter Web, so we get Web MVC, we get an embedded Tomcat, etc. And then we have this H2 database that we can use for our database in our application. The first thing I like to do is just go ahead and run this application. I just want to make sure everything starts up normally before I go ahead and start adding to it, and it does. So the first thing that our tutorial says is that we should head over to resources and application.properties, and we should go ahead and add a few properties. So I'm going to copy those from the blog post and paste them in here. And let's just talk through these. So this first thing that we're doing here is we're adding the data source name. So the data source name is just going to be people. Well, we're going to be building out a little bit of a contrived example here. This is a CRM that's going to hold a person entity and an address entity. So we're just talking about storing people and their addresses. So that is why I have named it people. So we're using the H2 database. We want to enable the console. This just allows us to go to a specific URL and view the contents of our database. With that data source, with H2 here, we have this property that says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and generate a unique name. And that unique name gets generated every time, and we don't want that. We want a name that we've defined here. So the default for this is true. I'm going to set this to false. And then I'm actually just going to turn on the show SQL feature of JPA. So as we're doing things, it'll get logged to the console and we can see that things are happening. So the next thing that we're going to do is we want to start creating, the heart of any database application is the model. Like, what are we modeling our application after? And as I just said, we're going to create a bit of a CRM where we have a person and a address. So the first class that I'm going to create is a person class. And I'm going to go ahead and mark this as an entity. Again, we're working with Spring Data JPA. This isn't a JPA 101 tutorial. If you're interested in me putting something like that together, I'd be happy to. Let me know. There's plenty of info out there on JPA, so you can go ahead and look at that if you want to stop and work on that before you kind of go through this. But what we are doing is we are marking this class as an entity, and we're going to go ahead and define some fields on this. The first one is an integer called ID. And this is actually complaining right now because, hey, that person should have a primary key. And we're gonna mark this as a primary key here. And we don't want to set this, so we're going to have Hibernate go ahead and generate that value each time. So with that, now we can go ahead and add some more properties. I'm going to say I need a string of first name. I need a string of last name. I need a string for phone number. And I also need a string of email. And finally, I'm going to need an address called address. I don't know why. Well, I know why. I have automatic imports turned on in IntelliJ, and this is the only address it can find. Let's fix that and create a new address over here. Again, we're going to go ahead and mark this with @entity, and I'm going to go ahead and let's see, we're going to need a private. We're going to use an integer ID, so this will be the same as last time. We need an @ID, and we need an @generated value. And then I'm just going to create a few properties here. We're going to create a noarg constructor, And I'm also going to have a constructor for everything but the ID. I'm going to generate getters and setters. And I know this question's probably coming up in your head. Can we use a record here, Dan? We cannot. Not with JPA because records are immutable. I know it stinks. I wish I could. I love records. It makes everything so much cleaner and quicker. But this wasn't that bad to use the IDE to generate all this stuff. Now, if you're using Spring Data JDBC, you can use records with that. So go ahead and check out Spring Data JDBC if you're interested. Okay, so now with that, we can get rid of this annoying import and provide our own. Why is it not letting me? All right, let's see. There we go. All right, so we're going to go through this fun again where we generate a no-arg constructor, where we generate a constructor that takes everything but that. This is still complaining. Oh, we need to fix that. We will. Let's go ahead and add a getter and setter. And finally, a toString. Okay, so now this is complaining because we have to make the association. So when it comes to JPA, this is really the toughest part, is understanding the relationships between properties. So this address is the address that we have created here, but it is basically saying that, hey, you need to define a relationship here. And so what we're going to do is say that this is a one-to-one. So each person has one address, while one address belongs to one person. We're also going to go ahead and say that I want you to cascade type all. I also want to go ahead and set the join column. So I just want to say that we want to store the address ID. So this is going to be the reference to the address ID, and it's going to reference the column name ID over in the address table, right? So that is really all we need when it comes to Spring Data and Spring Data JPA. So we have our entities created. The next thing we need to do is we need a way to read and persist data from our database. This is where Spring Data really shines, kind of giving us that functionality to perform most of the common operations right out of the box. And what I really love is that this is really a consistent programming model across all of the Spring Data projects. So as I mentioned before, there's Spring Data JDBC and Spring Data JPA. No matter which one we're using, we have these repositories that we can use. And then whether you're using WebMVC or Webflux, Reactive, we have repositories for that as well. So what I want to do is I'm going to create a new package here. We're going to call this repository. And I'm going to create a new Java class called person repository. And in here, oh, and I already messed up. I got ahead of myself. So we are going to create an interface called person repository. That's right, interface. So this interface alone isn't going to do much, but the real power comes in when we go ahead and extend one of the Spring Data repositories. So let's look at these. I listed these out in the blog post, but the ones that we have available to us are repository. So this is, did I grab the wrong one? Yeah, sorry. So extends repository. This is the one we want. And so if you look at repository, there really is nothing in here. This is not giving us any functionality, but there are reasons that you would want to use this one. Maybe you wanted to not make all the functionality that's available in, say, the Crud repository or the paging and sorting repository. You wouldn't want to make all that available. Maybe you just want to make a read-only type of repository. That'd be a good place to start. There's also the Crud repository. So the Crud repository contains all of the Crud methods that we might want to do in our application, like save a new person or find all people or find a particular person by their ID or delete them, update, etc. So this is all that CRUD work that we would normally have to write on our own. That is all given to us for free. Finally, the last one I want to look at is the paging and sorting repository. So each of these, if you saw, have two arguments. First is the type. So the type of repository we're building here, and in our case, we're working off the person entity. And then in that type, what is the ID of the person? So you remember when we set that up, that was actually an integer. So defining those two things here is really all you have to do. Now, what happens when when the application starts up, Spring can see that you've extended this paging and sorting repository, and we'll go ahead and make an implementation at runtime. So let's look at this paging and sorting repository. So first thing you want to look at is it extends the CRUD repository. So if we want all of the uh, functionality for building out a CRUD app, we get it from the paging and sorting repository because it extends that. But the paging and sorting repository also gives us a couple of methods for, as you guessed, paging and sorting. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But this is all we need to get started with paging and sorting. So now what we need is we need a way to go ahead and add some data when the application starts. So one way we could do this is we can go into the resource folder here and we could create some SQL by hand, but who wants to write SQL by hand? I don't know about you, but I do not. I'd much rather write some Java code and add some new records to the database that way. So one way that you can achieve this is by implementing a couple different interfaces in Spring. One is called the command line runner, and one is called the application runner. Both uh, allow you to execute some code after the application context is created and right before this Spring application.run method has executed. If you're interested in learning more about the command line runner, I updated an article on my website. You can go ahead and check it out. It just talks a little bit more about the command line runner and why the heck you might want to use it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new package here. We're going to call this data. And what I'm going to do is create a new class. I'm going to call this sample data loader. And this is going to go ahead and implement the command line runner. And because we're implementing that command line runner, actually, let's jump into it and take a look at it. So this is a functional interface because there is a single method in here, and that method is called run. So if we are going to implement that interface, we need to go ahead and implement that method. So let's implement run. Now I will take a little bit of a side tangent that I talked about in the command line runner article. You may see some people go ahead and do this right in the main application class. And that is because the main application class is, at the end of the day, a configuration class. So in a configuration class, whether it's this one or one that you create on your own, that will go ahead and scan for beans. So if you can define beans in here, and so you could just say, hey, give me a command line runner, call this command line runner. This is now a opportunity to use a lambda here. So we're going to say args, and inside of here, you could just say something like command line runner. So then if you go ahead and run this application, you should see this in the console. And we do. So great. Now that we have that, I don't want to do it here. I just wanted to show you that it was possible there. I actually want a class because I'm going to do some things in here. Now, if we were to run this and do that same thing in here, loading sample data, if we were to run this, our main application class right now, nothing would actually work. And that's because we have to tell Spring about this class. It has no idea this class exists. We can do so by marking it with the add component annotation. Again, that's one of those stereotype annotations that just says, hey, Spring, please go ahead and manage this class for us. So with that, we would get the same effect. But now what we want to do is I'm going to go ahead and just copy some code in here. Actually, let's just write it out together. So I am going to get in a final person repository. We're going to call this repository. We will use constructor injection in here. I'm also going to get a logger. We'll call this logger factory dot get logger, and this is the sample data loader, and that is that. So now I can just say info. Okay, so now that I have an instance of the repository, we could say repository.save, and we can save off an entity, right? So this will allow us to go ahead and save an entity. And the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to create a instance of a person. I'm going to copy this right from the blog post. So now I have an instance of a person, first name, last name, phone, email address, and address. And no, I do not want that one. And then I can just pass in this person instance. And now what happens is, because this is marked with that component, and because we implement the command line runner, this run method is going to get called, and this code is going to get executed, and we're going to save some information in the database. So let's see if that happens. You can see down here, we've actually inserted 2 rows, one into the address database and one into the person database. And again, that is due to the way that we set this up. We told Hibernate to cascade, so we've created a new person. We have a new address in here, so basically Hibernate knows, hey, I need to go ahead and persist both of these records down, and then it's going to create that relationship in that table for us. So let's head back over to the browser and take a look at the H2 console. All right, so we're going to load up the correct URL. This is in memory, and the name of the data source is people. The username is SA, and there is no password. So I'm going to connect, click on person, and click run. And you can see that we have our one person row in here with the column address underscore ID that references address number 2. So let's clear this out, click on address, and we see address number 2 has street, city, state, and zip. All right, let's head back over to the code. All right, so while this is going to work, it's going to take us a long time to get enough sample data in our database to properly test out pagination. Like, I want hundreds of records, and I'm not going to do this by hand. So what we are going to do is we are going to turn to a library called Java Faker. And Java Faker is really great because it's a nice library that allows you to generate fake data. So here is the GitHub repo for it. To get this into your project, we just need to go ahead and add the dependencies. So I'm using Maven. I'm going to grab this dependency. And then there's a bunch of instructions in here. I actually did a video tutorial on Java Faker as well. So I'll go ahead and link to that in the description as well. Let's go ahead and open up pom.xml. We're going to add that dependency. We're going to reload our Maven changes. We're going to stop that. And now we're going to head back over to here. So in here is where I want to kind of save off a lot of data. The first thing that I need is an instance of that faker. So one thing I can do if I wanted to, I'm going to go ahead and add private final faker. We need to say this dot faker is equal to new faker. So this will work just fine. This is the only place I'm using it, so that's okay. If I was going to use it multiple places, and even in the final code, this is what I did. I would come in here and create a bean, and I would say faker, and return new faker, right? So now this is going to be a bean in the application context. Spring is managing this for me, which means that I don't need to do this. I can say, hey, go ahead and add a constructor parameter. And now Spring will auto wire in that instance of faker for me. So just, just a simple, quick note on that. Okay, so now that we have faker, Now what I want to do is create a whole bunch of sample data. So let's create 100 rows of people in the database. So how do we do that? One way we can do that is we can use this int stream. So I'm going to use int stream and I'm going to say, give me a range closed. So range closed. And I'm going to start at 1 and end at 100. And as I'm doing that, I'm going to map to an object. So I'm going to map to an object. And I'm going to map to a new person. Nope, not that one. There we go. So once I map each one of these rows to a new person, I want to go ahead and use the to list. So you used to have to do like this. You have to say collect and then use the collectors.toList. And as of recent, we now can just say, hey, I want to go ahead and turn this into a list. Now, the reason I want to turn this into a list is because now that once I have a list of 100 persons, or people as we like to call them, we can use our repository and save all. You'll see that save all takes an iterable. We can go ahead and pass our list of people into there. So now we can go ahead and save all of those 100 people at once. So this works, but we need to start creating our people. So inside a person, remember the person constructor takes a first name, last name, phone number, email, and address. So let's use Faker to insert some fake data. So I'm going to call Faker. I'm going to call name, which has a whole bunch of, so if we look at name here, this actually returns a name object, which has things like full name, first name, last name, etc. So I'm going to choose the first name, faker.name.last name. So the one thing that with Faker, and I think I mentioned this in the tutorial, you got to look at the docs and you got to look at these different, what these objects are returning, because like phone number doesn't return a string. So I need to get an actual phone number, a string out of there. So I'm going to grab cell phone. There is nothing called email address. There is an internet. So again, if you jump in here and look at internet, it returns an internet object that has a whole bunch of things like safe email addresses, domains, URLs, avatars, images, passwords. So all of the things on the internet you might need. So from internet, I'm going to say, give me an email address. And now I need a new address. So inside of address, I'm going to call faker.address. Address returns an address and it has all of the things that you might need in an address. So again, very handy library that lets you just get some like real data to work with. So I'm going to say address.city, faker.address.state, faker.address.zip, and that should be it. So again, we're going to use an in-stream, run from 1 to 100, map each of those to an object, which is going to be a person object. And then we use our faker library to go ahead and generate some fake data. Once we have this list of 100 people, we call save all. So this should save 100 people in the database. So let's go ahead and run this. And hopefully no errors. We saw a bunch of logging there, which is good. So let's head back over to the H2 console. And if we take a look at our person table, we have 100 records in here. And again, this is great. This is actual like real data. So not real data, but actual data that we can work with. So if we wanted to do some like filtering and sorting, we could. So we have all of these records in here. If we clear this out, we have addresses in here as well. Again, just some nice data that we can use to work with. Okay, so with that in play, we have all the data in our application that we need. Let's talk about paging. So to get started on the web side of things, I'm going to create a new package called controller. Inside controller, I'm going to create a new controller called the person controller. So inside the person controller, we're going to make this a REST controller. We're going to respond to a request mapping of /API/people. And in here, we're going to create just one mapping, but let's hold off on that for a second. So the first thing I need is actually an instance of our person repository. So I'm going to just call this repository. And then we'll go ahead and add a constructor parameter. And now that I have the repository, I can go ahead and create a method that will accomplish what we want to do. But before we do, I want to look at this person repository one more time. So this person repository extends paging and sorting repository. And there's a method in here called findAll that returns or that accepts an argument of type pageable. Of type pageable is an interface. So we actually need an implementation of this interface to work with. So there is something in Spring called the page request. And if we look at page request, that extends the abstract page request, which also implements pageable. So that is the exact class or implementation that we're looking for. In this class, there are some nice static helper methods called of. So we can say page request.of, give it a page, and give it a size. And this is exactly what we are looking for. This will return a page request, which will in turn satisfy this argument type because of everything that's happening behind the scenes, right? So that will allow us to get exactly what we're looking for. So we're going to create a get mapping here. We're going to create a public. The marker for that return type was a page. So we'll see what page is in a second. Page of persons. And then we'll call this find all. So we're going to take two request parameters in here. We need the page, which is the page that you're on. So it starts at 0. You can have, say, 10 records per page, but when we're on page 0, we're going to have records 1 through 10. When we get to page 1, we're now talking about records 11 through 20. So we're going to start with a page and then a request parameter for the size. So how many records per page do you want to display? So we just looked at that page request before. We're going to use that. We'll call it a PR. And then we're going to use that static method in there called of. So page request.of. And now it's going to take in there's a bunch of overloaded methods here. The one that we care about just takes in a page and a size. So we have those as arguments in our method. So we're just going to pass those along. And now that we have that page request, we can go ahead and return the repository.findAll. And again, that is taking a of type pageable, which page request is. So we can say PR, and that should be that. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and restart our application and head over to the browser. And instead of going to the H2 console, I'm going to go to API/people. And I'm going to do page 0, and we're not actually going to sort. So page equals 0. Let's just do a size of 2. I'm going to hit enter, and now you see that we only get these first two records. So we have our first two records and then a whole bunch of other stuff. So that page of persons, what we get back is we get some content. This includes the people, but we also get a lot of information that may be useful to clients. So here's this thing called pageable, and then there's these other properties, and then whether it was sorted. But you can imagine returning some of this information to the client, like, is this the last page? That's false. That means that on a client where I had some navigation, I can go ahead and enable the last button or the next button. So I could say, I can allow them to keep clicking next until last is true. And then when that is the case, then I would disable the next button. So the same with first. How many, what is the size? What number are we on? How many of the total elements are there? based on those total elements and the size, how many total pages do we have? So all of this information is very useful to the client. So it really depends on what you want to return to the client in that case. But this is all you really need to create some pagination. So congratulations, you just created an application that uses Spring Data JPA and you've built in some pagination. So the client no longer needs to say, give me all of the records in your database. They can be very specific with what page they want and how many records they want per page. So again, it really depends on the client needs now on what data you're going to return to the client. So I really hope you enjoyed this. Again, I'm going to follow this up with a GraphQL pagination example. The reason I kind of started with this is from the GraphQL side, GraphQL doesn't care about your data layer. So this data layer is what it is. The data layer, even in this scenario, the REST controller doesn't care about your data layer. That data layer is independent. The REST controller, you're kind of defining, how you're taking those request parameters in, and then you're calling the repository, which is going to do the same thing no matter whether you're using REST or GraphQL. So I really hope you found this useful. If you did, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel, reaching out to me if you have any questions on this stuff or any tutorials that you'd like me to create. If you can't tell, I love doing this. So with that, I'll leave you. And as always, friends, happy coding.